Explain why your species has not yet destroyed itself. Petra Ilyanova had been ready for a version of this question. She had not been ready for it to come out sounding so bored, like the evaluator was reading the 14th line of a form she'd filled out 4,000 times before. The three of them sat behind a long, pale desk with no visible seams, no nameplates, no water glasses sweating in front of them the way there would be at any human hearing. Just the three aliens, and her, and a low hum from somewhere in the floor that she'd stopped noticing an hour ago, and now noticed again because her pulse was matching it. "I'm sorry," Petra said. "Could you clarify what you mean by yet?" The evaluator who had spoken, thin, gray-skinned, four narrow eyes set in a vertical line down the center of her face like beads on a string, didn't blink because Petra had learned an hour into this that none of them blinked the way she expected. "You have had industrial capacity for word cannot translate cleanly, approximately 200 of your years. You have had capacity to end your species outright for perhaps 90 of those. You have not done it. We would like to know why in your own words rather than in the words of your species historians of which you are not one." Petra was not a historian. She was not a general either, or a philosopher or anyone whose photograph had ever been printed larger than a passport thumbnail. She was a records coordinator for the Interstellar Liaison Office, GS-11 equivalent, 6 years in the job, and she was on this chair because the person who was supposed to be on this chair, Ambassador Oyeleran Amadi, career diplomat, 40 years of experience, a man who had once talked a hostile trade delegation out of a walkout using nothing but a story about his grandmother's garden, had food poisoning from a dinner 2 nights ago that half the delegation staff was still recovering from, and someone in Geneva had looked at the empty seat and the ticking clock and decided that a body in the chair was better than an empty one. So it was Petra, in a blazer she'd bought for a cousin's wedding, answering the opening question of a hearing that would decide whether humanity got to leave its own solar system on anything faster than the slow, monitored, chaperoned lanes reserved for species still on probation, or whether it got told politely and finally to stay home. She glanced down at the folder in her lap, the one Geneva had couriered to her hotel room at 11 the night before, containing 3 pre-approved anecdotes, a glossary of translated honorifics she'd only half memorized, and a single laminated card that read, in bold, "Do not volunteer information not directly asked for." She had read that card 4 times on the shuttle over. She was already fairly sure she was about to ignore it. "I think," she said, "it's because most of the people who could push the button also have kids." The 4 eyes didn't move. "That is not a complete answer." "No, it's not." She exhaled through her nose, tried to find the version of this that didn't sound like a talking point. "We almost did it. Twice, that I know are publicly documented, and I'd guess at least once more that isn't. There were decades where the number of people with their finger near that particular button was small enough you could fit them in a room like this one, and some of those people did not like each other, and some of them were having very bad days. We got lucky. I want to be honest that some of it was luck. Luck is not a governance model." "No," Petra agreed. "It isn't. But it's not nothing either, and I'd rather tell you that than make up a better story." The hearing chamber, she'd been told before they sealed the door, existed for exactly one purpose: to determine impulse control under provocation. Not military strength. The Council had access to more raw force than humanity would field in the next 3 centuries and had made a point, early in the briefing packet, of stating that this was irrelevant to the proceedings. Not technological parity, not culture, art, philosophy, none of the things the pre-hearing prep sessions back on Earth had spent the most time on, as if those were the metrics that mattered. What mattered, what the entire architecture of this chamber and this council and apparently this entire wing of galactic bureaucracy existed to measure, was whether a species, faced with something that made it angry, chose to escalate or chose to stop. Species that passed were folded slowly into the wider network, monitored trade routes first, then diplomatic postings, then decades or centuries later, full unrestricted travel. Species that failed weren't attacked. Nobody came to bomb Earth into rubble for getting the wrong grade on this test. They simply closed the door. A perimeter would be established at the edge of the solar system, invisible and permanent, and humanity would be left alone with itself forever, cut off from every other voice in the galaxy, quarantined the way you'd quarantine a patient whose illness you didn't want to catch but didn't feel obligated to cure either. It was, Petra thought, a genuinely horrifying policy specifically because nobody involved seemed to think of it as a punishment. It was filed, administratively, under public health. She had asked in the pre-hearing briefing back on the station whether there was an appeals process. The staffer who'd walked her through the paperwork, a harried mid-level attaché who clearly wished this were someone else's job, had looked at her the way you'd look at someone asking whether there was an appeals process for weather. "You can request another hearing in the next cycle," he'd said. "There's no cycle length listed. Some species wait what would be your decades. One waited what would be your centuries." He hadn't offered that last detail kindly. He'd offered it the way you tell a new hire about the fire exits, because it was procedure, and because not knowing it would be worse. "You understand the shape of this proceeding," said the second evaluator, broader than the first, plated in something between scale and bark, with a voice that came from somewhere in his chest rather than his mouth. His name, translated, was a compound word that meant something like the one who remembers nothing past the third season, which she had not had time to ask about. "We are not measuring your strength. We are measuring what you do with it." "I understand," Petra said. And then, because the silence stretched and somebody had to fill it, "I'd like it on the record that I think that's a better test than the one I was expecting." The first evaluator, gray-skinned, 4 eyes, the one who'd asked the opening question, made a small sound that might have been the alien equivalent of a laugh, or might have been her species clearing something from an air passage. "Noted," she said. "For the record, I am Evaluator Thren. I have sat on 11 of these hearings. I approved the last species who came before you." Petra hadn't been told that. Nobody in Geneva had mentioned that any of the 3 evaluators had a documented history with the process, and she filed the omission away as either an oversight or a strategy, uncertain which was worse. "How did that go?" Thren's 4 eyes did something in sequence top to bottom that Petra would later describe to a colleague as the closest thing to a wince I've ever seen on a face with no eyebrows. "It did not go well. I will not detail it for you. It is not relevant to your proceeding except that it is relevant to me, and you should know that, because I intend to be thorough today in a way I was not 12 years ago." That was not a threat exactly. It landed like one anyway. Thren did not waste time working up to it. She had a data slate in front of her, thin black edges that flexed slightly when she tilted it, and Petra had the distinct uncomfortable sense that whatever was on it had been assembled specifically for her, and she began reading from it in the same flat, administrative voice she'd used for the opening question. "Your species maintains, in its most translated and most repeated public documents, a stated commitment to the equal worth of all its members, correct?" "Broadly, yes. And yet your historical and current record shows persistent, unresolved conflict over the allocation of small, low-value resources between members of the same immediate community. I am given to understand there exists a body of recorded human disputes over." She checked the slate, and Petra had the horrible premonition of what was coming half a second before it landed. "Designated positions for the temporary storage of personal ground vehicles, adjacent to shared residential structures. Parking spaces," Petra said. "Parking spaces," Thren repeated, testing the shape of the words. "There are recorded instances of physical altercation, of prolonged litigation, of what your own records describe, and I am quoting, as neighbors who have not spoken directly in 11 years. Over a designated rectangle of pavement, in a species that claims equal worth for all its members, and cannot resolve who parks where." Petra had known abstractly that this line of questioning was possible. She had not expected it to be about parking. She'd prepped for questions about wars, about colonial history, about the things humanity was ashamed of on a grand, documented textbook scale. She had 3 pages of careful language in her briefing folder about the 20th century alone. She had nothing prepared about parking spaces, because who prepares a defense of parking spaces? "That's true," she said, because there wasn't a version of not saying it that didn't make it worse. That's a real thing that happens." Your species claims peace as an aspiration and cannot agree, in many of your political subdivisions, on where one region ends and another begins. Your borders are drawn, redrawn, contested, in some cases violently, in cases that long predate any of the larger conflicts your historians consider significant enough to name. If you cannot resolve the question of pavement between two individuals who see each other daily, why should this council believe you can resolve larger questions at larger scales involving people who will never meet? Petra sat with that for a second longer than she should have, because the honest answer that came to her first was, "I don't know if we can," and she was aware enough of the room to know that saying that, first, cold, without context, would not help her. "I don't have a clean answer for that," she said instead, which was close enough to true that it didn't feel like a lie. "I could give you one. I could tell you a story about how humans build consensus through shared institutions. And it wouldn't be false exactly, but it would be curated. It would be the version of the answer that sounds good in a hearing room. I don't think you want that version. You've clearly done the research to know it's not the whole truth." Thren's eyes moved down the row again, slower this time. "Then give me the truth. The truth is that we fight about small things because the small things are the ones we're allowed to fight about, without it becoming catastrophic. Nobody's launching anything over a parking space. Some neighbor might not talk to you for 11 years, but 11 years later they're both still alive and their kids grew up 2 doors down from each other, and probably at some point, one of them shoveled the other's driveway during a bad winter without either of them mentioning the feud. That's not consensus. It's not resolution. It's just a low simmer that never boils, because boiling costs too much, and neither of them actually wants the other one dead. We don't solve most of our small conflicts. We just find ways to keep living next to them without letting them become large conflicts. I don't know if that's a virtue. It might just be exhaustion. But it's what actually happens, more often than not. And I'd rather tell you that than tell you we're better at this than we are."
The third evaluator. She hadn't heard him speak yet, hadn't even fully registered his shape beyond a general impression of something tall and folded, like a piece of origami that had decided to sit in a chair, shifted slightly. It wasn't a sound. It was barely a movement. But Thren's eyes flicked toward him for exactly as long as it took Petra to notice, and then flicked back, and Petra understood without being told that whatever had just happened mattered to Thren in a way it hadn't a moment before. Thren returned to the slate, though Petra had the distinct impression she was no longer reading it so much as using it as a place to look while she thought. "There is a second category of dispute I want to raise, smaller still than the first. Your species has, in numerous recorded instances, engaged in prolonged and formalized conflict over the placement of physical barriers between adjoining properties. Fences. In several jurisdictions, there exist entire branches of civil law devoted almost exclusively to the question of where precisely one person's fence may sit relative to another's, and these disputes can run for years across multiple courts, at a cost, in your currency, that would have purchased the fence and the land beneath it outright, many times over." "That's also true," Petra said, and found herself almost smiling despite everything, because it was such a specific and so entirely accurate a thing to have found. "I don't think I can defend the fence law either." "I do not require you to defend it. I require you to explain it." "I think," Petra said slowly, working it out as she said it, "it's because the fence isn't really about the fence. Nobody spends 4 years and their retirement savings arguing about 11 centimeters of dirt because the dirt matters. It's a stand-in for feeling disrespected, usually, or unheard, or like the other person assumed they could just take something without asking. The fence is small enough that you can afford to fight about it for years without it destroying you. It's a place to put something that doesn't have anywhere else to go." She paused. "That's not a defense. It's an explanation. I don't think they're the same thing, and I don't want to pretend they are." She almost didn't tell them about David. It came up because Thren, unsatisfied, or perhaps satisfied in some way Petra couldn't read, which felt worse, asked her to provide a specific example, not a species-level policy, not a treaty, an instance, something small enough to hold. Petra thought about lying. She thought about reaching for one of the 3 pre-approved anecdotes in her briefing packet, all of which had been workshopped by a team of communications specialists in Geneva to sound humble while actually being flattering, the diplomatic equivalent of a humble brag. She thought about the story of the peacekeeping mission in the packet, the one with the photograph of the aid worker and the child, the one that always tested well with focus groups. She didn't reach for any of it. 3 years ago, she said, I worked with a man named David Okonkwo. We were on the same project team, a records migration. Not important what it was, it doesn't matter. I did most of the actual work on a particular deliverable. He presented it to our director as primarily his. I found out. She paused, looking for a word that wasn't going to translate as anything softer than it should. I was furious. I confronted him in the break room in front of 4 other people, and I said things I'd thought about apologizing for since, except I still think most of them were fair. He said things back. It got loud enough that someone from another floor came to see what was happening. And, Thren said, and nothing happened. Nobody hit anybody. Nobody got fired. Our director split the difference, gave both of us credit on the next thing, which honestly neither of us thought was fair in opposite directions. And for about 4 months, David and I did not speak, unless a meeting required it. Petra's hands were flat on the table in front of her, and she made herself keep them still. Then one Friday, I was getting coffee, and he was in line ahead of me, and instead of the usual nothing, he asked if I wanted to split a table because the place was full. And I said yes. Mostly because I didn't want to stand there holding a coffee looking for somewhere else to sit, which would have been its own kind of scene. We didn't talk about the project. We talked about a show we were both watching. It was nothing. It was 2 people being mildly less unpleasant to each other than the alternative required. That is the example you have chosen, Thren said. It wasn't quite a question. We still get lunch most Fridays, Petra said. 3 years later, we've never once talked about what actually happened. I don't think either of us has fully let it go. I think if you gave both of us truth serum right now, we'd both still say the other one was more wrong. But we get lunch. And somewhere in that, I don't have a clean word for it. It's not forgiveness, exactly. It's more like a decision, renewed weekly, not to let something stay a wound. She looked up. That's the actual example. It's not impressive. I didn't bring you a peace treaty. I brought you a guy I still think stole credit for my work, and a standing lunch reservation. For a moment nobody spoke, and the hum in the floor was the loudest thing in the room. It was the second evaluator, the one who remembers nothing past the 3rd season, the broad one with the voice from his chest, who broke it, and what he said was not what Petra expected. I do not find this compelling, he said. Petra had braced for a lot of responses, not for this one, delivered so plainly it took her a second to register it as a rebuttal rather than a simple statement of fact. Can I ask why? He considered the question longer than she expected, and when he answered, it was not with the flat certainty she'd heard from Thren, but with something closer to genuine effort, as though he were translating not just language, but an entire framework she had no equivalent for. Your species treats the resolution of your David story as evidence of virtue, a test passed. I want you to understand that from where I am seated, it reads instead as evidence of exposure. A vulnerability your species carries permanently, one that never closes, that must be managed fresh every time it is triggered, for the rest of every relationship you have. You are not curing a wound. You are rebandaging it, forever, and calling the fact that it has not yet reopened a triumph. My species does not hold what you would call a grudge, he said, not because we have decided to release one, the way your David and your coffee suggest you did. We are incapable of sustained resentment as a matter of biology. Our memory architecture does not retain emotional charge attached to a specific event past a period your calendar would measure as roughly 90 days. After that period, the fact remains, I would still know factually that a wrong had been done to me. But the anger does not survive the season. It cannot. It is not a choice we make. It is a limitation of the tissue. That sounds, Petra said carefully, like it would make a lot of things easier. It does. and I want you to understand why I am not moved by your story of the coffee line." He leaned forward, very slightly, and for the first time since the hearing began, Petra felt like she was being looked at rather than processed. "You are describing an achievement that required effort, 4 months of friction, a choice made once that could have gone the other way, and by your own account nearly did not and might not again under worse conditions. You are asking this council to credit your species for restraint that is effortful, fragile, and, by your own admission, not guaranteed to hold under greater strain than a stolen work credit. What happens when the provocation is larger? When the stakes are not a coffee line but a colony, a resource, a death? You have shown me a species that can, sometimes, with visible strain, choose not to escalate over small things. I have not yet seen evidence of what happens when the thing at stake is not small. It was, Petra thought, the single most unsettling thing anyone had said to her in this room, precisely because it wasn't hostile. He wasn't accusing her of anything. He was simply pointing, with total clarity, at the actual hole in her argument, the one she'd been half aware of and hoping nobody would name directly. "You're right that I can't promise you it holds," she said. "I want to be careful not to promise you something I can't back up. What I can tell you is that the effort itself might be the point. You don't have to work at not being angry. We do, every time. It never gets easier, not really. It's not a skill you level up in until it's free. It costs something every single time, and we do it anyway, over and over, millions of times a day, all over the planet, in break rooms and parking lots and legislatures, and most of the time nobody notices because it worked and nothing happened. I don't know if that's less impressive than what your species does automatically. I think it might actually be more, precisely because it's not automatic. But I understand if that sounds like I'm just defending a weaker system, because it's the one I've got." "It does," he said, "and it does not. Both things are true. I have not decided which one matters more." The interruption came without warning. The way these things always seem to in the movies Petra had watched as a kid and had never quite believed, because in real life bad news usually arrived by email, quietly, and you found out an hour after everyone else already knew. A panel in the wall. She hadn't even registered it as a panel until it opened, resolved into a small floating projection above the desk, angled so all 4 of them could see it. Thren read it first, and Petra watched her 4 eyes move down whatever was scrolling there, and watched her expression do something that Petra, 6 years into a career built on reading rooms, recognized immediately as "this is worse than I expected, and I am deciding in real time how to say it." "There has been an incident," Thren said. "At the Kessler waypoint. A human colony transport, unrelated to your delegation, unrelated to this hearing, registered separately under a private consortium license, 3 hours ago, by the timestamp. A docking error, panic, from what the preliminary report indicates, not intent, resulted in a hull breach. Injuries, fatalities. The number is not yet confirmed." Petra felt the floor of her stomach drop out in a way that had nothing to do with the hearing, and everything to do with the fact that somewhere, right now, people were dead, and she hadn't known until this exact second, and she was finding out in a room designed to judge her species for it. "How many?" she said. Her voice didn't shake, which surprised her. "Preliminary reports suggest between 6 and 11. The uncertainty is due to the chaos of evacuation procedures, not concealment." Thren set the slate down. "I want to be clear about something, Delegate Ilyanova. This incident is not on its face an act of violence in the sense this hearing measures. It appears to be an accident, compounded by human error under stress. But it will be presented to you now in real time, because that is also part of what this proceeding measures, not only how your species behaves when it is angry, but how it behaves when it is caught unprepared, in front of the people judging it, with no time to construct a version of the story that serves it. You want to see how I react?" "I want to see how you react," Thren agreed, "because you will not have time to consult anyone. You will not have time to call Geneva. You are the only human in this room, and something has just happened that you did not cause, that you cannot fix, and that will be attached to your species record, regardless of what you say in the next several minutes." Petra sat very still. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a version of herself that had spent 6 years drafting careful diplomatic language was already reaching for phrasing. Preliminary reports are often revised. An isolated incident should not be read as representative. We would ask the Council to reserve judgment pending full investigation. And she recognized every single one of those phrases as true, defensible, and completely useless in this exact moment, because all of them were about managing how the room felt rather than about the 6 to 11 people who were dead 3 hours ago on a transport she'd never heard of. "I don't have a defense for this," she said. "I don't think I should try to build one. People died. I don't know their names yet. I don't know if it could have been prevented. I'm not going to stand here and tell you it reflects well on us because I don't know that, and pretending I do would be worse than saying nothing. That is not what this council requires of you," said the third evaluator. It was the first full sentence he had spoken since the hearing began, and the room's attention swung toward him with a force Petra could physically feel, like a change in air pressure. He was, up close, harder to read than the other two. No eyes she could locate with confidence, a surface that shifted texture slightly depending on the angle of the light, folded in on himself in a way that made his exact shape difficult to hold in her mind even while she was looking directly at him. "This council does not require you to defend an accident you did not cause and could not have prevented from a room a light year away," he continued, his voice quieter than either of the others, and somehow more present for it. "It requires you to tell it what your species does next."
Petra thought about it for longer than was comfortable, and nobody in the room rushed her, which she understood correctly as its own kind of pressure. "I can't tell you it won't happen again," she said finally. "I'd be lying if I told you that, and I think you'd know I was lying, and it wouldn't help either of us. What I can tell you is what happens after. There'll be an investigation, not run by the company that owns the transport, an independent one, because we don't trust companies to investigate themselves, and we've learned that the hard way, more than once. It'll take months. It'll probably be public, or most of it will, because we've also learned that when this kind of thing gets buried, it happens again, faster and worse. Someone will be found responsible, or several someones, and it usually isn't satisfying. Usually it's a training failure or a maintenance schedule or a warning light someone ignored because the schedule was tight, something boring and structural rather than a single villain you can point at and feel resolved about. People will be angry that it isn't more satisfying. There'll be new procedures afterward, and some of them will actually help, and some of them will just make people feel better without changing anything, and it'll take years to know which is which. And in 20 years there'll be some other version of this same accident, somewhere else, because we don't actually get better at not making mistakes. We just get slightly better, sometimes, at not making the exact same one twice. That is a bleak account of your own institutions, Thren said. It's an honest one. I'd rather give you that than a better story that falls apart the first time you check it. Petra looked at the projection still hovering above the desk, the scrolling numbers that hadn't stopped updating. 6, now 7 confirmed. I don't know what your species does when something like this happens. I don't know if you have accidents like this at all, but I'd guess, if you do, that you handle it differently. It was Thren who answered, and something in her voice had changed. Not softened exactly, but lowered in a way that made Petra think of confession. We do not have accidents like this, she said. Not because they do not happen, because our records do not retain them the way yours do. My species' relationship to failure is administrative. In a way I am only now hearing myself describe accurately for the first time. When something goes wrong at scale, badly enough that the institution responsible would be discredited by its retention in permanent memory, it is not concealed exactly. It is not called a cover-up. It is simply deprioritized, filed in archives that are technically accessible but functionally unsearched. Within 2 generations, the event exists only as a rumor, a thing people half remember hearing about, unattached to names or dates or consequence. The species I approved 12 years ago, the ones whose disaster I have spent this decade managing quietly on the political side. I could show you almost nothing about what happened, not because it is hidden from you, but because it has already functionally been allowed to become unfindable. That is how we survive our own failures. We do not investigate them publicly and sit with the discomfort for years. We let them dissolve. The room was very quiet. "I don't think that's worse than what we do," Petra said carefully. "I think it might just be a different kind of survival. But I don't think I'd trade for it. I think if we stopped making our failures uncomfortable, on purpose, in public, we'd stop learning from them at all. The discomfort is doing something. It's ugly and it's slow, and half the time it doesn't even work. But I don't think we get to keep it and also skip the part where it hurts." The third evaluator was the one who ended it, and he did it with almost no ceremony at all. "We have what we require," he said, and the finality in his voice was somehow both total and completely unreadable. Petra could not, no matter how she turned it over afterward, have told you whether he'd said it the way a judge says it before an acquittal, or the way a judge says it before the worst possible verdict. His tone did not change for either possibility. It occurred to her, distantly, that this might be exactly the point. "Before you conclude," he said, "I want to ask you one question that is not part of the formal record. You do not need to answer it for the hearing. I am asking it for myself." "Okay," Petra said. "If we tell you no. If your species does not pass this proceeding, and the perimeter is established, and you are told that you may keep your solar system and nothing beyond it, indefinitely with no stated end date, what will your species do?" Petra thought about Geneva. She thought about the 12-hour flight she'd taken to get to the station this hearing was held on, the cousin's wedding blazer, David, and the standing Friday lunch neither of them had ever fully explained to the other, the 6 now 7 people on a transport she'd never see, whose names she still didn't know. She thought about how none of the answers she'd prepared, not one of the 3 pre-approved anecdotes in her briefing folder, had survived contact with this room, and how the only thing that had gotten her through the last 2 hours was refusing to reach for them. "We'll try again next cycle," she said. "That's the only lever we actually have. We don't get to appeal to a higher body. We don't get to threaten you into a different outcome, even if some people back home would want to, and I promise you some people back home would want to. All we get to do is keep being what we are as honestly as we can manage and come back and ask again. That's not a strategy. It's just what's left when you don't have another one." The third evaluator didn't respond to that. He didn't nod. She wasn't sure he had a part of his body that would register as a nod. And he didn't look at Thren, or at the other evaluator, in any way she could see. But something passed between the 3 of them anyway. Some current she wasn't part of and would never be shown. A look exchanged in a register she had no access to, over in less than a second. "The proceeding is concluded," Thren said. "You will be informed of the outcome through the standard channel within the standard interval. Thank you, Delegate Ilyanova, for your candor. It was—" She paused, and for a moment, her 4 eyes were unreadable in a completely different way than the others had been all day. "More than I expected from a species I had already, somewhat unfairly, decided I understood." Petra stood. Her legs had gone stiff from 2 hours in the chair, and the blazer she'd bought for her cousin's wedding suddenly felt like the wrong thing to have worn, though she couldn't have said what the right thing would have been. She gathered the folder she'd never opened, the 3 pre-approved anecdotes still sitting inside it, unused, and walked toward the door, and none of the 3 evaluators said anything else, and she did not look back to see whether they were watching her go. The door sealed behind her with a sound so quiet she almost missed it. In the corridor, alone, with nobody from Geneva to report to and no verdict to carry back, Petra Ilyanova stood still for a moment and thought, more than anything else, about David, about the 4 months of silence and the coffee line and the fact that neither of them had ever once said sorry, and how somehow, against every reasonable prediction, that had turned out to be enough to build something on. Her phone, cleared for use only in the corridor, never inside the chamber, buzzed once against her hip as the station's local network picked her signal back up. A message from Geneva, time-stamped an hour ago, asking for a status update she had no way to give them yet. Another further down from David, who had no idea where she was or why, just a photo of the coffee place with a caption that said, "Saved you a seat, weirdo. Sent on schedule." The way he did most Fridays, whether she was in the building or not. She hoped it would be enough here too. She had no way of knowing if it would be. She started walking anyway because that was the only lever she had,